All right. Well, my clock says 7 o'clock, so we will get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Plight of the Grey Whales, a Wake-Up Call. My name is Caitlin Birdsall, and I am the Executive Director of the Marine Education and Research Society. And I have the privilege of being one of your co-hosts for tonight's webinar. I will be joined along with my colleague, Jackie Hildring, who you will hear from in just a moment. Before we get started, however, we do want to always take a moment to share acknowledgement and also gratitude for the fact that the Marine Education and Research Society, our activities occur primarily on the traditional and unceded territory of the Clayoquot. We also recognize that many of you are joining us from throughout North America, so we encourage you to take a moment to reflect on the Indigenous lands in which you reside, while we also acknowledge the other Inuit, Métis, Native American, and First Nations that are throughout North America. And we make this acknowledgement as a way to combat historical erasure, as a way to foster respect and understanding, and also as a very first step, one of many, towards true reconciliation. So tonight we are gathering to learn about gray whales and the concerning trends being observed about the North Pacific migratory population. And we do want to recognize that while MERS has been loosely following the situation with gray whales for several years and feeling concerned, it really was a letter authored by three gray whale researchers, Jim Darling, Jorge Urban Ramirez, and Stephen Schwartz, that really provided us with a big wake-up call last year that this was a situation that needed immediate attention. If you'd like to read this letter, you can actually find it linked to our blog at mersociety.org, where we have our most recent blog on gray whales. So thanks to these researchers for shaking us up a little bit and following sort of the concerning data coming out of this winter and spring, we realized that we needed to take action to further amplify this call to action that they so quickly and articulately made. So today we have brought together 5 experts to tell us more about gray whales and what they're witnessing here in the Pacific Northwest. So our speakers today will be John Calambokidis from the Cascadia Research Collective. And John's going to spend about half an hour telling us a bit more about the big picture about gray whales, as well as what has been happening with the population and what the Cascadia Research Collective has been observing in Washington State. We will then hear from Wendy Szaniszlo and Paul Cottrell of Fisheries and Oceans Canada, who will tell us a bit more about DFO, or Fisheries and Oceans Canada's research and response efforts, particularly around gray whales. Next, we will have Ashley Hoyland and Mark Sawyer from the Whales of Clayoquot and Barkley Sound project, who are going to be telling us a bit more about what they have been witnessing in the field off Western Vancouver Island with gray whales. And then finally, we'll hear from Jackie once again on what we can do to better support gray whale conservation. I just wanted to note, while we have welcomed a pretty widely distributed audience today, which we are very grateful for and welcome, we did want to note that, as you can tell by the speakers, we are going to primarily be focusing on research and observations in Washington State and British Columbia. So with that, I'm going to pass things over to Jackie so she can run us through a few pieces of tech housekeeping for the webinar.
Thank you very much, Caitlin. So indeed, as the Director of Education and Communications, I'm supposed to know a lot about Zoom. If you don't, lucky you. Yeah, you have somehow managed having to have that kind of expertise. But a few settings that you may have noticed already is with the volume of people that thankfully are so interested in the plight of gray whales, we do not have a chat function for you. We do have Q&A. So please, if you have questions, put it in the Q&A and we will answer those questions at the very end. And that is being done because it may well be that a question that you're asking will be then covered by a following presenter. So the Q&A will be at the end. We have put aside 15 minutes for the Q&A. If there are questions beyond that, there will be a follow-up email, and we can put resources in there for access after the webinar. You're all muted, of course, and here we go. Onward. Oh, sorry, apologies. communications expert. So if you want to control the view that you have, you see the little box that popped up with the red arrow, you can control your view by selecting from that menu. Now, truly, we move on.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jackie. And we are going to get started with John Calambokidis from the Cascadia Research Collective. And we're going to pass it over to you, John, to share your screen.
Great. Thanks so much, and appreciate you guys holding this event and having a chance to talk to all of you. And I think as was mentioned, I'm going to focus on our work in Washington State. And I think we have a couple of different ways that I'll explain that give us insight into what's going on with gray whales, as well as try to put that into a broader context of how things are going overall with gray whales. For Washington State, but this sort of holds for the Pacific Northwest, including BC, there are different gray whales that we have that use our waters. And you can break them up different ways, but this is sort of my division of them. There's the overall Eastern North Pacific group, and this is the group that primarily breeds in Mexico, feeds in the Arctic, and really, for the most part, migrates past the coast of Washington and British Columbia, northbound in spring, and that's what's going on right now this time of year. But I'm going to be talking about a couple of other groups that, depending on, and we might hear a little more about this, can be treated sometimes as a part of that overall Eastern North Pacific group, or can be considered somewhat independent. The Sounders gray whales that I'm going to refer to are a group of gray whales that come into northern Puget Sound, really close to the Washington, BC border, and feed in spring. And I'm going to tell you about them, and they give us a particular insight. There's the Pacific Coast Feeding Group, which has gone by a few different names. I'm not sure I like that name or acronym. This is the group, Jim Darling initially studied back in the 1970s off Vancouver Island, and that feed in spring, summer, and fall in the Pacific Northwest from Northern California up through Southeast Alaska. And then we also have, and I'll cover this at the very end, Western gray whales that used to be thought to be separate, but more recently have been found to migrate through our waters as well. So those are some of the kind of different categories and groups. And our research at Cascadia really began going back to the 1980s. And we studied both the Pacific Coast Feeding Group. We began a collaborative catalog with other researchers, and one of the most important of which is Brian Gisborne, a researcher that works along the coast of Vancouver Island and for DFO, and has gathered a treasure trove of information on the Pacific Coast Feeding Group. Our own effort at Cascadia began in the early 1980s with gray whales that were coming into the Strait of Juan de Fuca and Puget Sound. And it was in 1990 that we began studying the Sounders gray whales that I'll talk about. And we've studied some of those whales now for 36, 37 years. We also are the primary responders for whale strandings in Washington State. And we've done that going back to the late 1970s. And I think Washington State sort of has a great history, partly because we had the National Marine Mammal Lab that was here that helped in response to gray whale strandings early on, and we had a number of volunteer organizations. So I think we have one of the best long-term histories of gray whale stranding spanning 50 years that I'll give a little perspective on. And we also engage in entanglement-related research and response for large whales that often involve gray whales along the US West Coast. Now, just to take those categories I talked about earlier and just to look at them on a map. I'm going to hopefully use my cursor, which I hope you can see. Gray whales, primarily breed down in Baja, Mexico, down here in the lower right of this map, and then primarily follow a coastal migration route up to their primary feeding grounds in the Arctic, shown in red up here to the north. The green area along the coast from Northern California shows some of the areas used by the Pacific Coast Feeding Group that I mentioned that often don't migrate north, but feed in these more southern waters, but they're a much smaller group. The Sounders gray whales I referred to are shown in this inset here and use a very small area of northern Puget Sound that's shaded here. And finally, that western North Pacific gray whale population I spoke briefly about, and I'll talk about at the end, actually feeds to the left of this slide. This is the Sea of Okhotsk and Kamchatka Peninsula, and they actually primarily have been documented off Sakhalin Island, which is just off this map to the right. Now, NOAA has some of the best data. NOAA is the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, a U.S. agency that has tracked gray whale populations. And one key insight that we have in how gray whales are doing are their annual counts, sometimes skipping years, but more recently conducted every year that count the number of gray whales migrating past a point in Central California and corrected for animals they miss. That's resulted in this top chart that shows, just going back to 1994, the estimated gray whale population. And, in some ways, if I'd shown this going even further back, you would have seen gray whales represented this success story of coming back from just a few thousand gray whales in the early 1900s up to now, where you see this chart here with the scale on the right. In 1994, they were estimated at around 20,000 gray whales. So that made this major recovery. But through this recent period, there have been several periods of elevated numbers of strandings. And I'm going to give you more details on those. But in this particular graph here, you can see these are these shaded areas on this top map. One that occurred in 1999, 2000. They were referred to as unusual mortality events, or UMEs. And then the most recent one that went from 2019 to 2023. And you'll see as we talk about this that really, even though this was declared over in 2023, you'll see why really the subsequent information we've gotten suggests it has not ended. The main thing I'll draw your attention to is from 2016 to 2025, a less than 10-year period, their estimates of abundance went from 27,000 down to 13,000. So to less than half in 10 years, a fairly precipitous decline. Now there's some questions about how these gray whales are reacting to this crisis that might be affecting those counts, but it still represents a really precipitous and catastrophic decline in estimated gray whale abundance. And along with it, on this lower chart, you see the estimates also gathered by NOAA, counting the number of calves migrating north after they're born primarily down in Mexican waters. And you can see in many good years, there were close to 1,500 calves born a year. But what you'll really notice that's particularly scary is that the most recent estimate in 2025, this point, the farthest right, is actually under 100 calves estimated born in 2025. And you can see really going back a number of years, really the last 6-7 years, there have been extremely low numbers of calves born to this population. Another sign that it's, facing a major crisis. And if you look back at a few of the other things, like, for example, this past unusual mortality event in 1999, 2000, where the population dropped, you'll see the number of calves also dropped. But then a few years later, it bounced back and you saw large numbers of calves born. And in some ways, that's what we were hoping we would see after this most recent mortality event. But we certainly have not seen any sign. Now, keep in mind, some of these up and down variations, there is some error in those estimates. So, for example, there might be a new estimate coming out in the next month or two, and it might show a slight blip up or down, but the overall trend has been very strongly downward. Now, those unusual mortality events, and particularly this one that went from 2019 to 2023, involved documented strandings, deaths of animals washing up all along their range. This is from that 2019 to 2023 period and shows the locations of strandings from the Mexican breeding grounds, along the California coast and Oregon coast, Washington, British Columbia, and on up into Alaska. So you can see the mortality that was being seen what occurred throughout their range. And a lot of this mortality occurs in winter and spring, and I'll show you a little more of why that is the case. Now, here's that kind of zooming in to Washington State and that more precise set of strandings that we've documented for 50 years in Washington State. And I'll draw your attention to, first of all, here's that 1999-2000 unusual mortality event here in the middle that occurred. You'll see this next period, our record mortality was in 2019, and it's been elevated since. You'll see in other than these unusual mortality event years, typically the number of strandings only tended to be on average about 5 animals, sometimes less than 5, sometimes more than 5. But in these 2 years, 1999-2000, the total of the 2 years was 50 animals. And in this 2019 record year, it was 35. Now you can see most of those strandings in Washington State, this is broken up by month, occur in the spring and early summer. The highest number of mortalities we see are in April, May, and June. Those are the 3 highest bars. But you can see after that, next highest is July. So right now, we're kind of about halfway through that peak period of mortality that's occurred. I'll just make one other note while I have this graph up. You'll notice that after 2019 and the subsequent years and 1999-2000, the next highest pair of years are 1990 and 91. So if you can just keep in your mind those 3 time periods, 1990, 91, 1999, 2000, and then starting in 2019, you're gonna see those reappear in a number of graphs that have significance. So this year in Washington State, we are now up to 23 confirmed gray whale strandings. We're already, at tied for our 3rd highest ever for an entire year, and we're only through part of May at this point. These are the number of strandings, 17 that had been documented through the end of April, and there were 17 of them through the end of April, which is what really got us alarmed. That was an unprecedented high number of strandings through April, even for past years. One of the things that got a lot of attention in the US is this early April stranding here that is attributed to Raymond, was an animal that swam up the Willapa River alive and ended up what we call out of habitat up that river and survived in the river for a number of days before dying up the river. And that got a lot of attention because it was so unusual, but it also kind of signaled a start of a rapid set of strandings that then were occurring roughly at 1 every other day through the month of April. Now, why is that unusual? Now, if I plot those strandings for the last 50 years, but only show the number of strandings through the end of April of each year, you'll now see that the number of strandings, 17, that we had in 2026 through the end of April was higher than we'd seen in any other year in the last 50 years. And while that is troubling enough, the context for that was that this was now a population that we think was down to less than half what it was just 10 years ago. So proportionally, that number of strandings is even more significant as a proportion of the estimated population. For Washington State, our strandings occur in broad areas. Most of them are concentrated along the outer coast of Washington State. A few were animals documented floating offshore that you see out here. And then you can see a large number of scattered sightings in inside waters. And I think later you're going to see some maps of where these have been found in British Columbia So this is just the Washington portion of those strandings. And, I've broken down these bars really show the number of strandings, per half a degree of latitude along the coast. And we definitely tend to have the most strandings around Grace Harbor. And we think that's partly because of the beach and current and the fact some animals come into these inside waters and die there. But we also think as you get to the more remote parts of the northern Washington coast, that's where we're also more likely to have some animals that escape detection and don't wash up. And we think that's part of the reason this drops as you go north. And also keep in mind these number of strandings, and when I plot these in relation to the counts, you'll see that while hundreds of animals strand, it reflects that thousands of animals are dying. And you can tell that from the changes in the population size. So most of the animals that die do not wash up and show up as these strandings. These just represent something like 10 or 20% of the animals dying. The rest either don't get documented offshore or sink to the bottom. Now we're going to briefly visit just some of the ways those periods of high mortality interconnect with other factors. Here you see that graph I showed earlier with the circled 3 time periods. This is showing both some of the counts done by NOAA, but it also shows a population model developed by Josh Stewart. That's this shaded line with error bars that tries to bring in other data. And you'll see these 3 areas, these 3 downward bars are where there were major declines in population that exactly line up with these 3 periods of elevated strandings. So those 2 fit together well. And I'm going to talk shortly about the Sounders gray whales. And here are gray bars superimposed on the scale to the right of when new animals came and joined the Sounders. And you can see these gray bars also perfectly line up with those darker bars behind. So new animals came and joined the Sounders exactly in those years of high mortality. And we'll come back to that point. Now, some of these up and down numbers of gray whales led a number of us, Josh Stewart, with that model he developed, led this article that was published in Science that reported these boom-bust cycles in gray whales and these fluctuations and trying to kind of understand this pattern of what was going on. And it was a really valuable piece of work that kind of showed how other parts, the bursts, the documented strandings, the body condition could all be brought into a model to analyze these things. But I think we got one crucial thing wrong. And that was that we thought maybe this most recent mortality event was going to be a short phenomenon because we actually wrote this up, only a few years into that unusual mortality event. And we thought, okay, we've seen this happen before. They're affected by prey abundance in the Arctic, but they're at carrying capacity, and then they bounce back. And that's what we haven't seen. And that led us, there's actually another paper we tried to put out. It didn't get as much profile much more recently, where we tried to sort of correct our view and say, hey, what's going on now doesn't look like it fits into that model we were describing of boom-bust cycles. This is kind of a boom-bust-bust cycle. It's continuing on a downward trend. Now, what's going on with this? And, there's some commonalities, and you'll see this come out of other elements of my presentation, that many of these animals show signs of emaciation that are stranded. They're thinner than normal. We're seeing them in the spring, which is right at the end of their seasonal fast, where they're headed back to the Arctic to feed. And this would be when they'd be under their greatest nutritional stress. And so what we think this mortality reflects is gray whales that did not get enough to feed the previous season in the Arctic, and they do not have enough of a reserve to complete their migration and are literally running out of that nutritional reserve. And there are a number of studies, Sue Moore and Jackie Grebmeyer are 2 researchers that, I think have been doing really valuable work looking at prey abundance in the Arctic and the relationship with gray whales. And I've just stolen a few things here that I'm going to make a point of. they published a paper talking about changes in their observations of prey abundance in some areas of the Arctic. And I'm just going to point a few things out of this. Particularly, this is showing Alaska and Canada and Siberia here. And these boxes correspond to these figures on the right. And I'm going to focus on this box number 1, which is shown here. This is an area called the Chirikov Basin. It's an area that gray whales had been heavily documented feeding. And in this chart over here, and this one here, we're looking at prey abundance of on the benthos that gray whales feed on. And the main point I want to show you is that there's been a substantial decline in the prey abundance, across these years. Their study went through 2019 and 2020. And you can see here, blue is low prey abundance, and then green was some of the high prey abundance. And you can see how that almost disappears in 2018 and 2019. And that's reflected in this figure. The challenging part is that as conditions have changed in the Arctic, so has the distribution of gray whales. They've been able to access more areas, search for prey in new areas. So while they may have now stopped using that Chirikov Basin area, they have been exploring other areas to feed in the Arctic. So they've changed some of the areas they've been looking for prey. I don't think I'll show too much more on this. This is just taking from another paper, talking about some of the changes in especially water temperature occurring along the bottom in the Arctic. And the main thing I want to point out is in the Arctic, there's been a dramatic ecosystem change. Ice cover has decreased, but that has affected a number of other things, including current patterns, water temperature on the bottom, sediment transport and sediment type in different areas. And the combination of those factors seems to be affecting this gray whale prey that they have. Now, one of the ways that we know that at the heart of the issue is prey in the Arctic is that we have examples of other gray whales that supplement their feeding in other areas. And one of those groups is the Sounders gray whales. And this is maybe a little bit of a hopeful sign. These gray whales that come into Puget Sound from March to June and feed on intertidal ghost shrimp, well, they don't seem to be showing nearly this kind of mortality. They actually seem healthier than the gray whales that proceed straight to the Arctic, even though they're feeding on, only for this period of typically 3 to 4 months on ghost shrimp that they can only access at high tide. And these gray whales, one of the things we wondered initially when we started studying these Sounders gray whales that use this shaded area here is what would motivate gray whales migrating past, that's what this yellow line shows, motivate these whales to make this detour down the Strait of Juan de Fuca, find this tiny opening at Admiralty Inlet, navigate into Puget Sound, around Whidbey Island to this one area where there's dense ghost shrimp, and discover this high-risk feeding strategy where they have to go into the intertidal zone in shallow water to access this prey. And that lineup with mortality answers what would motivate whales to do this, and it's desperation. And that's why we've seen Sounders kind of come and develop and explore this area in those years when there was high mortality. That's when there was desperation. And I'm not going to belabor this figure. Along the top axis here is year, starting with 1990, over here to the left. The first year we discovered the Sounders gray whales. The rows are different Sounder individuals. And there's a little over 20 individuals listed here, through 2026. And the shaded areas indicate we saw that whale that year. And here's where you can see it was initially 6 individual Sounders that discovered and then started returning annually to this area in 1990 and 91. And then you can see here's another 7 individuals that discovered this area and again started returning annually, starting in 1999 and 2000. And now you may be remembering those 3 time periods I mentioned. And the last period that we've seen a whole bunch of new Sounders come in and again start returning is not coincidentally 2019, this 3rd period of high mortality. So these are whales that in desperation are searching for alternate areas to feed, and in this case have had great success finding it. I'm going to just go to this slide to show you kind of over these time periods. This is months on the bottom and how many different sounders were using the area. Starting in the 1990s, you can see small numbers up to 5 or 6 a year, and primarily just in February through June. Then you can see in the 2000s to 2018, that number expanded after that mortality event in 1999, 2000. So now you see more up to 10 sounders a year, and you'll also see a slight broadening of how long they stayed and fed. And then here's our most recent period, in this case going through 2024. And now you can see more sounders staying longer, and even some animals staying through the year. And we've actually had 5 animals this year show up in December and early January and forgo migrating to Mexico entirely and come here and start feeding and stay feeding throughout the winter as well as the spring, basically making the trade-off to feed instead of to go to the breeding grounds. That's the point I made. Now, we do know that these sounders, with some of the work we've been doing with John Durbin and Holly Fernbaugh, experience rapid body condition improvement when they're feeding in this area. So they're getting a huge payoff. So these two aerial photographs up here on the right show the same individual in the same year, in February when it first arrived, and then in April when it had been feeding for several months. And you can just see how much girthier she's become. And these figures over here just show examples of that rapid increase in body condition seen for most of these individuals. And the example down below is just to show you, especially some of the new individuals just discovering this area for the first time. And this animal here is shown in darker black here, did not show as much of an improvement. So definitely some of the experienced animals were getting the best benefit from it. We've also gotten quite a bit of insight from our tag deployments on gray whales to look at how they're feeding, and that includes the sounders. I'll just point out, we used to deploy these tags by approaching in a boat and using a pole. We also collect a skin sample. This is actually a kid's crossbow that has a dart that bounces off the whale and collects a small plug of skin. But then more recently, we've been working with Ocean Alliance, deploying the tags from drones, where we just are able to drop the tag and it attaches with a suction to do that. And you can see we can just stay at a safe distance away. This is us in the background in that. And these tags give us an enormous amount of information. We've analyzed this in collaboration with the Goldbogen Lab at Stanford University, and especially this graduate student here, Hannah Clayton, has been focusing her PhD dissertation on the Sounders gray whales. These tags not only give us this rich set of sensor data, but they also are able to film some of the behavior. Like this is the very first tag we deployed in 2015 on one of the pioneering whales. It did reveal that these whales have frequent body contact. In this case, it turned our tag around from facing forward to facing backwards. But it ended up showing one way that information is transmitted by some of these experienced sounders, some of the other new whales arriving. And as this whale, Earhart, one of our pioneering whales from the first year, swam into shallow water, you'll see if I fast forward ahead here, that she ends up having 3 different whales follow her into the shallows to get both the timing and the location of where to feed. Okay, and I'm going to skip that. I'll just show you that we get a lot of really interesting data. We're able to document every feeding event of these whales. It showed that most of their feeding is on these intertidal ghost shrimp. They're diving only to a depth of about 2 meters because it's really shallow in the intertidal. They're rolling. This red line below shows they're rolling on their right side to feed. Okay. Sometimes gray whales that try to feed in the shallow get in trouble like this whale did. And we've been involved in trying to free some of these whales that have gotten stranded. I'm going to go a little faster to wrap up. I'm trying to wrap up in the next couple of minutes here to stay in my half-hour slot. We've been working with a number of collaborators, especially on the PCFG database. We have over 3,000 unique gray whales we track with their natural markings and over 50,000 records of them. We're able to see that the Pacific Coast feeding group, that group that feeds in the Pacific Northwest, this is the estimated abundance they have. And you don't see those huge fluctuations that you see in the larger population going to the Arctic. Again, the sounders and their health and gain in body condition, the PCFG whales with the stability of their population here, hovering for the last 20 plus years between 200 and 250 has been remarkably steady, show that the issue is with the Arctic feeding grounds and not the other feeding grounds some of these whales use. Maybe I'll leave it if there's ends up being a question. I will point out on the US side that we have also the Makah tribe have proposed a resumption of their historical hunt of gray whales. They did take a whale in May 1999, and I think at any month, we've been expecting it for a while, NOAA will likely announce permission for for the Makah tribe to resume that hunt in coming years. I said I'd just show a slide on the Western gray whales, these ones that feed off Sakhalin Island. And I just wanted to show a couple of slides to show this was the surprise. This is a satellite tag Western gray whale we thought would migrate south. And instead, this red track shows it came across the Pacific right over here to where we, Washington and British Columbia, and then proceeded to migrate south to the lagoons of Baja. And this turned out to be a whale that Wendy, who you'll hear from later, actually cited in one of her years. And some of the other satellite tagged whales showed the same thing. Okay, let me just cut to some concluding things so I can wrap up here. I think we have a really good idea of the broader issues of what's going on with gray whales and that it's related to their prey in the Arctic, and it's being driven by climate change up there that is affecting a wide variety of factors. But we still don't understand a lot of the mechanisms of that benthic decline. So I want to be clear, there's a lot of research that's needed up in the Arctic. I also think with gray whales changing their migrations, we need some alternate ways to assess the gray whale population than just how many migrate past California. And then we also need to understand all these gray whales that we're seeing in other areas seemingly trying to adapt to find new areas to feed other than the Arctic. I want to point out there are a number of actions we can take, and I know we're going to have a little discussion later in presentation on actions you can take, but I wanted to especially address this maybe to some of our US audience, and those in Washington State. We need to find ways to reduce sources of mortality from entanglements and ship strikes that are also adding to this, food-related crisis they're facing. We need to protect some of these areas that gray whales are starting to use, like the Sounders gray whales, that have found alternate successful areas to feed, but often are in close proximity to human activities. And especially in the US side, we need to find a way to get back to the more valuable role the US played on climate change initiatives. And unfortunately, we've seen this huge step backward in the last year and a half on research, recognition, international treaties, measures we're taking in our own country. NOAA, the primary agency that does a lot of the gray whale research and funds research like our research, has been hugely constrained. They've lost 30 to 40% of their staff on the West Coast. So we've seen some dramatic cutbacks. I was just going to end briefly on this slide. I think there'll be information you can connect with the other groups on presentations, and Mayor's putting this on. But this is the link to our Cascadia Research website. If you're interested in some of our research, you can find it there, and encourage you to take a look at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John. That was fantastic. Such a great overview, and really such a nice summary of not only the work that you've been doing and your team has been doing, but also a lot of the great work happening south of our border here and learning about these animals. So thank you so much. As a reminder to everyone, thank you for popping your questions in the Q&A. We will be recording them and we will then be addressing them at the end of all the speakers. So stand by, you will get your questions answered, hopefully, and that will happen at the end. Now we're going to move over to our colleagues at Fisheries and Oceans Canada, Wendy Szaniszlo and Paul Cottrell. Over to the both of you.
Thank you, Caitlin, and what an absolute privilege to be here with you all. And thank you, MERS, for putting on this event. It's fantastic to see attention being given to gray whales. I'm going to start out by speaking a little bit about habitat use work and some surveys that DFO Science is working on. And then Paul is going to speak to some of the response work and the necropsy results that he's been working on, which will segue back into the photogrammetry work that science is undertaking right now to look at body condition. Also wanted to mention, coming right after John, that John in Cascadia, like John mentioned, has been doing a lot of gray whale work for many, many years. DFO is new kid on the block when it comes to gray whale work, and we've only been doing this for a few years. So what I have to present is really only a culmination of a few years of work that DFO has done with gray whales. John also mentioned the different gray whale populations that are recognized in Washington state. It is very similar here in Canada, except we don't have the sounders. Although I'm glad he mentioned the sounders because we do have gray whales feeding on ghost shrimp here in Canada as well. So in 2005, the gray whales were considered one population in Canada, and under the Species at Risk Act, that's a federal piece of legislation here in Canada, that population was listed as special concern. Years later, in 2017, after a fair bit more science was done and there was a greater understanding of gray whales and their genetics and their migrations, COSEWIC, which is the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, recommended that the one population of the Eastern North Pacific population be divided into 3 separate populations. The recommendation was that there be the North Pacific migratory population, and it was recommended that this group or population be considered not at risk. Now, I do want to emphasize here again that this was recommended in 2017 when the population was approximately 27,000. It's now 9 years later, and as John presented earlier, the population right now of this group is about half. So just let that percolate as we go through the subsequent talks here. Then there was also a recommendation that the Pacific Coast Feeding Group be recognized as separate and be listed as endangered, and then also the Western Pacific population. And the recommendation was that group also be listed as endangered. With the anticipation that the PCFG population was going to be listed as endangered, DFO undertook the start of its gray whale program. And this was knowing that if a species, in this case, the PCFG group population, be listed as endangered, there is a requirement by DFO to identify critical habitat. So habitat. Critical habitat is vital to the survival or recovery of a species. And Canadian waters are important for the PCFG whales because this is where they forage, whereas the migrating population does travel north to the subarctic and Arctic feeding grounds. What I do want to point out is very little is known about gray whale habitat beyond Southwest Vancouver Island. So years ago, a lot of work looked at the foraging ecology of gray whales in Clayoquot Sound near Tofino, and this was primarily done by the University of Victoria Whale Lab professors and students, as well as Dr. Jim Darling. So there is a wealth of knowledge about gray whales and their feeding in that one area, but very little, if anything, known in the rest of British Columbia. And of course, this information is vital to understand the prey, their habitat, and to help recovery efforts. This is some of the prey that is known to exist in Clayoquot Sound. These include mysids, amphipods, porcelain crab larvae, as well as herring spawn. I do want to point out that each of these little critters, the mysids, amphipods, and porcelain crab larvae, are all small as a grain of rice or even smaller, and they all have very different habitats. So one of the projects that DFO started to undertake to look at habitat use is being led by Dr. Erin Foster, and she's investigating the distribution and functions of habitat that's important to the PCFG animals in Canadian waters. And to do this, we collected skin samples. She was looking at diet analysis. And she was also looking at habitat use, foraging niches, and the relative importance of herring spawn to PCFG animals. The herring spawn is something that appears to be very unique to the Pacific Coast Feeding Group animals in BC. And this is why we wanted to take a closer look at the role of herring spawn. Most of this work was undertaken along the southwest coast of Vancouver Island, in Pacific Rim National Park Reserve along the West Coast Trail. And it was done in collaboration with Parks Canada, as from data they collected, along with data that was collected by Brian Gisborne. We also started undertaking some boat-based surveys, and this was to document individuals by doing photo identification and also looking at the abundance and distribution of PCFG whales in BC waters. This is one area of work that has had a lot of focus previous to DFO getting on board. NOAA has supported many years of photo ID work along the southwest coast of Vancouver Island, and supported contractors like University of Victoria Whale Lab, Brian Gisborne, myself, and apologies if I'm missing others. And these surveys were done annually between the beginning of June and the end of September. And it led to or contributed to that large data set that Cascadia Research Collective has. This is work that DFO has just started doing in the past couple of years. And again, part of it is to prepare for the assessment of critical habitat, and also to get a better sense of where the animals in BC are. To this date, just as with little knowledge or big knowledge gaps of habitat use of gray whales in BC, there's also very little known about where the gray whales are beyond Vancouver Island in terms of north of Vancouver Island and north of the central coast of British Columbia. Most of the work has focused for several years along the southwest coast and Vancouver Island, as well as around the central coast. So here's another area that a lot of research or a lot of survey work really needs to be done to understand just the most basic knowledge of where these animals are during the summertime. DFO is part of the Pacific Coast Feeding Group Consortium, and as part of the consortium has started contributing to PCFG range-wide surveys that happen during the summer. And they span between the Oregon coast and up to the central coast of BC. So I mentioned a little bit about the herring spawn data. That's very unique to British Columbia. This work is done primarily by Brian Gisborne. He's contracted out by DFO. Most of these surveys are done during March and April, and other boat-based surveys are done between the 1st of June through the end of September, and those surveys are along the outer coast of Vancouver Island. These thousands of photos, and by thousands I mean probably tens of thousands when it comes to Brian's data, is matched in collaboration with Cascadia Research Collective. Data from last year is still being processed, at least it is for the herring spawn work. And I did want to mention that last year in 2025 was the first time DFO had a dedicated science cruise focused on gray whales. And this survey occurred along the southwest coast of Vancouver Island, all the way up to the north end over the top of Vancouver Island to Port Hardy. And the main focus of this cruise was to collect body condition data with drones, as well as to collect skin samples or biopsies for diet work. And this work was done, or this work is being done in collaboration with others so that it will allow the assessment of body condition of other animals in the range with or throughout the animals range for the other rest of the population. What I did also want to mention for this work that was done last year is that along the entire west coast of Vancouver Island, it essentially did, in my mind, act like a survey. We only saw 16 individual gray whales, which I found astounding, shocking, because in previous years, just along the West Coast Trail, where Brian has done his surveys, he's found as many as sometimes 60 to 70 individuals just along that span. So it definitely shows that there are less whales using the waters of Vancouver Island this past year, but we still need to do a lot of work to understand why that's the case. I'm going to hand it over to Paul now, who's going to talk about the necropsy results and his stranding response work before I come back and talk about the photogrammetry, which will be a segue into the poor body condition that we are seeing. Thanks, Paul. All yours.
Thanks, Wendy. Great job. Big thank you to Jackie and Caitlin and Mers for setting this up. It is such an important topic, and I realized looking at my presentations, it's all a big Debbie Downer, dead whales. So I am starting with kind of a positive, and that is the Gray Whale Unusual Mortality Event Working Group. Unusual Mortality Event, as John mentioned, it's a U.S. designation. And when we started seeing this die off in 2019, this tri-nation, Canada, U.S., and Mexico was formed. And it was really important to put this together because these animals obviously move through many different jurisdictions, and we're all doing research and we have stranding networks and other things, but we need to coordinate our approaches to make sure we can compare results. And Deb Farquhar is the chair and the lead of that, has done an amazing job. And here I'm just showing some of the stranding networks from Mexico all the way through the US, Canada, and Alaska. And then, of course, the many sub-working groups and working groups around research that John obviously is part of, and others that do a great job of bringing everybody together and then looking at this issue and standardizing our approaches. And of course, in Canada, we have Dr. Stephen Raverty, who's a legend and has really set the stage for our program and really been a big part of this group in terms of standardizing necropsy approaches, sampling with other veterinarians in the US. And again, that's been huge to be able to look at these animals and compare results across nations. And also Sean McConaughey, DFO Research, is a representation on this group. Oops, let's just do this. So John had this slide already and did a great explanation of what gray whales do and their northern migration in the spring and then their southern migration in the fall. And the graph that Noah has and the great research around the change in population over time and these two kind of unusual mortality events and then this low calf production the last few years. So I had this slide in the same reason for John, just to show how dire this may be and how 2026 also in British Columbia has the same trends that John's seeing in Washington State and we're seeing throughout the range, which is really alarming. In terms of the overall numbers, and this is something that John showed, but you can see in 2019 when that unusual mortality event was initiated, we had very high mortality rates, both in Mexico, the US, and Canada. But that trend of mortality was decreasing. And then in 2024, as John mentioned, that UME was postponed. But unfortunately, a little prematurely as 2025, we saw that rebound for high mortality rates across the entire range. And as John mentioned, now in 2026, we're all seeing, like in BC, it's the same trend. If we get the same mortality rates going forward, we'll have more gray whale mortality strandings than we've ever had, and we're already at 8 animals. In terms of the district, I just wanted to again mention some of the work of these working groups. In terms of evaluating stranded dead gray whales across countries and researchers, there's been a variability in approaches, and this working group did a lot of work to look at pictures and body condition through vets, through experts, researchers, to come up with this standardized tables that we could all use when evaluating an animal washed up on shore. And I'm going to show you some pictures of gray whales we've had this year that have washed up, and it really is a useful tool to be able to evaluate the body condition and especially severely emaciated animals. And that includes the neck depressions, the lateral depressions of the animal because of the muscle degradation with the blubber, and also blubber condition from high lipid content to almost no lipids in watery, dry blubber. So all these were really important to standardize. So the results in Canada could be compared to the US and Mexico. And it's really helped, I think, to put all this together, which is showing these major decrease in populations. I think I missed a slide. That's okay. I'll go right into the gray whale cases that we've had in British Columbia. And again, similar to what Wendy was saying, in British Columbia, we're fairly new for resourcing this kind of work. We started really in 2010. And I know the US has a longer record of research into this, so it can go further back for the whole population. But in terms of gray whale mortalities from 2019 to 2026, we've seen a total of 40 animals. And geographically, which is John kind of touched on, the earlier in the season, we start seeing gray whale mortalities in Lower Vancouver Island and also often inside the strait. But then as the March, April progresses, we start seeing mortalities further north along the west coast of Vancouver Island. And the most recent mortality that we have was reported yesterday, and it's in Haida Gwaii. And you can kind of see that distribution from 2019 to 26. And one thing to note, our central coast is massive and very isolated and not populated. So, I think John mentioned a 10 to 20%. I think in BC waters, even though there's an amazing network and great volunteers and NGOs and people that report these dead whales, we probably miss more animals because of our isolation and just huge coastline. So that's one thing to note that's likely a bit different. We don't catch all our dead whales that even strand on the shore. Um, in terms of, and it shows too with a lot of the whales we've had this year have been somewhat decomposed, which makes it more difficult to do full necropsies. But because we have Dr. Rafferty, we sample almost every gray whale that washes up on BC waters, and of the eight, the eighth one we're gonna hopefully get to later this week. But out of the seven, we've sampled six of those and full necropsies on four of them. Starting in Nootka in January was an animal that we were able to get to. Most of these are by helicopter. They're very isolated, difficult spots. And it's been just a huge collaboration with local First Nations. The Clayoquot First Nation was amazing in reporting the whale and then going with us and working with us and assisting when we were doing the sampling with Dr. Rafferty. The same thing in Barkley Sound with Hayuit First Nation coming out and helping us sample. And I want to draw your attention to the bottom right. That's a gray whale that was photographed in Barkley Sound floating. And you'd think that a floating gray whale you'd be able to relocate. That's not the case. Often they end up who knows where, but we never see them again. But this is an animal, as you can see, the head, the peanut head, the depressions behind the head, and the dorsal side, the crevices were just hard to look at for this poor animal. And unfortunately, this animal we didn't see wash up and weren't able to sample this animal. Um, we also had another animal in Barkley Sound that again we were able to get and do the necropsy with Hayuit Barkley Sound First Nation, and we also had a whale in Sydney that washed up close to. It was actually floating close to the border. We didn't know if John's team was going to get this whale or we were, but the Wasanic First Nation out of Sydney, which is a collective of 5 First Nations, were our eyes and ears, and they were able to find the whale. And then that video you can see, we were able to tow this whale to Institute of Ocean Sciences in Sydney and do the necropsy, which is time lapsed with Dr. Rafferty doing probably 95% of the work. But this was quite disturbing in that this animal had severe cyanamid or whale lice infestation, and it basically looked like it had been eaten alive. So it was really hard to look at actually when we were doing the necropsy, and something that we do see and is an indication of an animal that's really in tough shape before it dies. Just to go through the last few, and you can see these animals are fairly decomposed. And, we always want to ID these animals, but these animals didn't have a lot of skin left, and the body, we weren't able to provide any useful pictures for ID, which was unfortunate. One interesting, with the 8 animals we've had, 7 have been males, subadult or young adult males, which is quite interesting, and I think consistent with what Washington State is seeing and California, Oregon. So quite interesting. It's better males passed than females, I guess, for the population. And the bottom right animal is the animal that we're going to look at doing a necropsy on later this week that was just reported. In terms of necropsy results, the common thread for all these animals has been, except for the female that was in Clayoquot, just very poor body condition, skinny. And Stephen is working on all those necropsy results, and he has samples all over to look at pathogens and just the lipid content and baleen, everything. But we won't have final reports for probably another month for many of those animals. And again, I just want to thank just all the folks, the researchers, the stranding networks, First Nations, NGOs, and researchers that from Mexico all the way to Alaska that really have made all this work possible. And to it's a lot of work to do necropsies and of course all the great research that's going on that John talked about, Wendy's talking about, and Mark and Ashley are going to talk about. So I'm going to pass it back to Wendy, and she's going to finish up with the research side of things. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Paul. That was a great overview, and I could almost smell your slides. I'm going to be just giving a quick overview here of some 2026 observations of whales so far, and briefly mentioning photogrammetry, but I'm going to let most of the photogrammetry topic be covered by Mark and Ashley. So far, we've had, or DFO has done some herring spawn surveys again this year, and that happened back in March and April by Brian Gisborne. He went up along the west coast of Vancouver Island. He had multiple reports of very skinny animals. I had the opportunity to go out into Barkley Sound in March, just after herring spawn. And this was the first time in about 15 years that I've been out around herring spawn and have not seen a gray whale, which I found quite interesting. Then in April, it was early April, I had the opportunity to go out in Barkley Sound, and there were at least 20 gray whales that we saw, and easily over half of them were emaciated. These here are images all of whales that were seen that day, and you could see the pronounced dip behind the heads, behind the blowholes. That is consistent with skinny whales or emaciated whales, and also their shoulder blades were protruding as well. So definitely presenting as malnourished animals. Photogrammetry, this is some work that DFO has started over the past few years, and we've been developing drone capacity to contribute to assessing the body condition of gray whales, primarily the Pacific Coast feeding group individuals. Why study body condition? Well, it's to measure the body condition and also assess the changes of an individual gray whale body's condition over time. So even within a year or across a year. And this was something that that John showed as well too, that at the beginning of the feeding season, the whales do seem quite a bit skinnier than later on in the season once they've had a chance to feed and fatten up. The photo of the whale here on the right was a whale that we saw last year, incredibly skinny. You can see the prominent spine protruding on the back, and also this very heavy lice load as well, indicating that this animal is not in good body condition. We had a lot of trials starting to use the different drones back in 2023. 2024, we used a LiDAR for the first time, and this allowed us to get better measurements. And we used the drone and collected photogrammetry imagery last year when we were offshore on the Coast Guard vector. We were able to collect images from 9 gray whales last year, and ideally, if there were a lot of whales in the area and we were able to get out, we would ideally like to collect drone photographs of the same individuals over time to be able to compare their body condition. So for next steps, we are planning another survey on the vector in July and the beginning of August. So we are hoping to collect more drone data during that cruise. And the main takeaway here is that we are using protocols that were developed by Oregon State University and using the same protocols that are used by Oregon State researchers, as well as Mark and Ashley, to be able to facilitate collaboration and sharing of data of gray whale body condition across regions. A lot of folks that I'd want to acknowledge, I'm not going to list them all, but this does here show the number of people that it takes to study gray whales that have one of the longest migrations in the world. And thanks to all these folks, and thank you, MERS, and for participants for listening in. I'm sure there'll be time for questions at the end.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Paul and Wendy. That was a really great overview of some of the work happening in British Columbia and also about sort of what's happening on the ground right now in terms of stranding. So we really, really appreciate that update. Very important. All right, we're going to move on to our third presentation of the evening. Mark Sawyer and Ashley Hoyland are a duo. Oh, look, they're both there. That means Ashley got her small children to bed, which is excellent. And they are from the Whales of Clayoquot and Barkley Sound project, and are going to give us some information about some of their observations from their work off Western Vancouver Island. So over to you both.
Thank you, Caitlin. Yeah, we've got the unenviable job of following all those incredible speakers. So yeah, no pressure. Bear with me here. So yeah, myself and Ashley conduct work off West Coast Vancouver Island. Permitted by Department of Fisheries to do the drone work that Wendy was alluding to, and as part of that work, we're research associates with MERS. So we're going to try and sum up kind of what we're seeing here on the west coast of Vancouver Island, and I guess if I do this right, kind of stress the importance, the need for collaboration with the whales that we see here. So the vast majority of the whales that we'll see over the course of the year, I think John had a slide that showed how, like, the percentage of the sightings that Cascadia have that end up being Pacific Coast Feeding Group whales are our. I agree with John about the name there. It's not the greatest name, so I'll just keep calling them the locals. But the vast majority of the whales that we see are our local whales. We record those. Some of them we will not the same whales, but we will see those whales every month of the year. We see them in January. We'll see them all the way through until December, and fairly predictably the same whales coming back at the similar times of year every year. As well as those guys that make up most of the sightings. Similar, I'm not going to say it's the same as what John sees with the sounders, but these are an example of four whales that are now visiting herring spawn sites off West Coast Vancouver Island in multiple years. We're seeing the same whales. I think of these parts of the coast as restaurants, and these whales seem to know which restaurants have got a good special at which time of year. And the herring spawn events off West Coast Vancouver Island are really important. And another nod to what I'm going to keep calling back to what other people have said, but when John was talking about the number of sounders and seemingly the spike and the new whales identified during these years of downturn. The whale in the bottom right-hand corner here was still hanging around in our area a few days ago after first being seen in March. We haven't had a sighting of this whale historically during the traditional Pacific Coast Feeding Group time, but it does seem like some of these whales potentially are showing not necessarily the same drive that they always have to get up the coast, that they're looking to stick and try out some other areas along the way. And then we're also seeing what Wendy just mentioned, that if you are an ENP whale, a whale that's heading to the Arctic, if you arrived here for the herring spawn, you normally seem to do okay. We didn't see many of those whales, if any at all, that gave us concern for their condition. They hit the buffet and they were looking great. But the whales that missed that bounty, they're the whales that typically look skinnier. You can see another whale. I think there was a question in the chat about how to tell the whales and how you assess whether they're skinny. You can see here, maybe the left of the photograph, the scapula, the shoulder blade of the whale protruding, and a whale that should normally be quite sausage shaped, they're kind of convex. You've got a lack of blubber or fat on the side of that whale. And this is something that we've seen for a few years, but certainly this year, the numbers, especially in Barkley Sound, just a huge number of whales that really missed that herring spawn event and stuck around and were not in good condition. And whether these whales are coming here to stick here for the summer, whether they're passing by and heading to the Arctic, whether they are heading into Puget Sound, and it's all about food at this time of year. And so I wanted to kind of explain what that looks like a little bit and try and use a whale as an example. I think in my head, historically, I had this idea of a whale migration being a nice, neat, they go up the coast to wherever they're going to feed, they feed there, they turn around and they go back down the coast. And more, thanks to collaboration and thanks to talking to other people studying these whales, you learn that that's not the case. And these whales do seem to have like a grass is greener mentality sometimes, where it's, oh, it's okay here, but it might be better somewhere else. And I'm going to use gull as an example. This is a whale that we photographed in 2024. And the last sighting we had of this whale was just on the open ocean coast, just outside Tofino off the west coast of Vancouver Island. 8 days later, the whale was reported down in Newport off Oregon. Now, I'm making an assumption because we don't know the route that that whale took, but assuming it traveled the kind of common close to shore route and was kind of looking for food along the way, 560 kilometers in 8 days. It was reported for a couple of days down there. We were information shared with us thanks to Oregon State University's GEM Lab. After 2 days in Newport, the whale had turned around, and 21 days after that was back outside the mouth of Ucluelet Harbor. These whales pinball back and forth up and down the coast and take advantage of whatever food is available. But it also stresses that need for cross-boundary collaboration. Paul's alluded to it there, that you need to have these collaborative efforts to understand these whales. It's impossible to study grey whales in a vacuum on one tiny part of the coast. Wendy said that you've got a year like last year where there were no whales on the West Coast Trail. Well, that could be bad for the West Coast Trail, or that could mean that there was great feeding somewhere else. And I think once you feed the data into places like Cascadia and you can really look at that whole data set, that's where we'll start to unpick exactly what a good year and a bad year looks like. And I'm talking about feeding, and I thought shamelessly, after knowing what was coming up with a whole lot of death, maybe it would be a nice thing to see a grey whale doing pretty well and a whale feeding. I'll preface this by saying, I know every year we get an email from Jackie, there'll be a report of a grey whale that's stranded somewhere on the coast. And when we look at the video or we look at the photograph, it's a whale that's having a great time feeding. These whales feed in incredibly shallow water at times. This was March 14th, just in the inlets around Tofino this year. The speckles and the light patches you can see around the whale, that is the ocean floor. You will see from this whale in a moment, the water is so shallow that while the whale's face is in the seabed, you will see the pectoral flipper sculling at the surface to hold the whale in place. They're suction feeders, and this was on a herring spawn site, an incredibly important, and I'll try and stress this with some data in a moment, but an incredibly important event for particularly our local grey whales. But I'll try and just leave this so you don't have to listen to me. I will say there are two whales. The whale in shot right now, we disregard in a moment, but I'll come back to this whale. This is a whale called Hip. That these two whales 2 years previous to this were in the same place together, feeding in much the same way. That, a lot has been said about their feeding behavior, but the social dynamics of these whales is also fascinating. The mud plume behind this whale, you can see that there is mud being disturbed around the whale's face, but it's also, you'll see in a moment, as the whale kind of rights itself and comes back to the surface to take a breath, you'll see the whale mouth closed, pulsing the sand and the sediment and the water out of the mouth, and left to trap those small, tiny little herring eggs in the mouth. You can see that sediment getting filtered out the mouth, and this will stop. This is a grey whale we know really well, a whale called Jane. It's a great case of these whales having research codes. Use Cascadia's CRC 842, but it's a lot easier at times to remember a name than a bunch of numbers. And she was a Jane Doe, a whale without a name. Somebody suggested calling her Jane Blow, and it was funny enough to stick with the name. But I'll move on from that rather happy whale and come back to that moment in a few moments. So a lot of the work that we were doing out here was based around knowing who the whales were, and the next logical question for us was how are those whales doing? And it was kind of an ongoing process that's taken a little bit of time, and we wanted to make sure that it was done in a way that any data captured here was of the most benefit. So like Wendy said, we're working with DFO and with Oregon State University's GEM Lab and trying to make sure that we're all doing things in the same way so that these data sets can be compiled and can be compared really carefully. So I'm going to try and walk you through that process. I know there was another question in the chat about exactly what area of the whale we're looking at, and I'll try and show that here. This is a whale called mini white, another terrible nickname that I'll not get into, but basically we fly over the whales using the drone, viewing straight down like you saw in that video of Hip and Jane. And from those videos, we'll take a screenshot and we process that. And the nice thing about Oregon State's work is that they've tried to make this whole workflow really open source and really available and make sure that this is accessible and that, you know, this is beneficial to the whales. So we use a piece of software that they provide and we measure the length of the whale. And then it splits the whale up into little 5% chunks, and we have to drag these red circles along the flanks of the whales. And essentially, there's a mathematical formula, but what we're looking at is the widths of the whale between the 20th percentile of length and the 70th percentile, which is a bunch of words that means this. That part of the whale is the important part of the whale that we're looking at when it comes to this body condition. And it spits out a number that is a body area index. And we can use that to compare these whales. And there's some work that's been done that shows from the boat level, from the flank, like looking at the flanks and the side view of the whale, you can tell a really, really skinny grey whale, and you can tell a whale that looks really good, but it's really hard to be accurate at where they're at in between there. And this has certainly been the case for us, that you can recognize a skinny whale and the numbers show it's skinny, but it's been really interesting unpicking those whales that sit somewhere in the middle. I've used this whale as an example because that is the whale on the left-hand side here, and that is about as close to the average body condition of a grey whale that we had last year, and also just an easy whale to work with in terms of the photo here. And I wanted to go through just some examples of what this looks like, and kind of what a whale in really good condition would look like and what might cause that, what a whale would look like in skinny condition and what could cause that if it's not food driven, and things like that. So again, I think it's easier if we drop these over the top, and forgive me for the people that maybe are in the call here that have seen this done more technically, but I've just done a rather crude job of drawing around those using using PowerPoint. But the whale on the left is an average grey whale. The next whale along this was the first day that we conducted flights last year on March 30th, and this ended up being, in March, the whale in the best condition that we saw all year. But it's not an exact science. It's not measuring how much blubber that whale has. There's another kind of secondary follow-up that you can do, and you can look at the relative width of the whale halfway along its body compared to its overall length. You can kind of look at it as a proportion of its overall length. And the second whale from the left, this image suggested that this whale was pregnant. And again, to hammer home the need for collaboration, we weren't sure that we would be able to detect pregnancy that early in a feeding season, and we were thrilled. I think she's on the call actually, so apologies if I get the date wrong, but we were sent a message by Alyssa Schulman-Yaniger, who works with the American Cetacean Society out of Los Angeles, and she sent us a drone video that somebody had taken down there saying, hey, do you recognize this this mum and baby? They're traveling south down the coast now. And thanks to that little kind of piece of the puzzle, we were able to confirm that this whale, that she was pregnant when we recorded her here, that she did calve and was heading down the coast, and now we're just eagerly awaiting her return. I'll drop some other names on these whales in a moment, but the whale in the middle here was the skinniest whale that we documented the entirety of last season. That is Jane that we showed you in that last video. If we had just seen this in August, this was August, kind of right in the heart of feeding season, we would have been incredibly alarmed. But there are certain reproductive states that a whale would be skinny. And we were sent a message from researchers at Oregon State University saying, hey, we've just had one of your whales traveling up the coast here. This was in July. She's with a calf. By the time she arrived with us, she'd separated from the calf, which is normal, that kind of 7 to 9 month window. But having just split from the calf, she is burning through her own blubber reserve, her own fat reserve to produce milk for the youngster, and she will be skinny. The thrilling thing for us was that when you compare that middle photograph to the one just to the right, that is a photograph of the same whale on March 14th this year. She was seen in the Tofino Harbor in February. We've got some debate as to whether she did actually make it kind of down the coast and migrate away or not, but kind of thrilling to see her rebound. And despite all these kind of positive stories, the one on the rightmost there is a whale really well known locally called Admiral. Turned up during the herring spawn, incredibly skinny, odd behavior. And there's whales like that where you can kind of see these BAIs that have been spat out here and who the whales are. But some of these whales are turning up and we don't have a reason as to why they're looking the way they are. I'm going to kind of work through this. I know I'm getting a message that we're running out of time, but the average body condition is kind of in the middle there. And just to drop where those whales were, you can see the difference in how much Jane, way on the right there, had rebounded between August and March. If these whales find food, and if it's an area where they know how to access it, then they can put weight on really quickly. That work that John referenced from SR3 with the sounders has showed just how quickly they can rebound. So the question there is, why aren't those whales arriving after the herring spawn? Is it a cultural thing? Have they not learned how to access the food in Barkley Sound at that time of year? The interesting thing was that initially there were a couple of our local whales mixed in, and then by the time that event finished, they'd all taken off and gone somewhere else, seemingly knowing better than to stay and try and feed in those areas. They are resilient whales. They are whales that will see fluctuations in their body condition. They can rebound if they access food. But again, another example of a whale. This is a PCFG whale and a sounder. This is Stripe CRC 185. This was our last sighting of this whale in September 2023. This, to answer the question in the chat again about how you recognize skinny whales from the side, you've got this kind of dip behind the head, which is somewhat flawed if a whale lifts its head when it dives. But you've got this kind of hollowed out section along the flanks. This whale we haven't recorded in the years since, and I'm not sure, I didn't see it on John's slides there as well. And it made us want to, kind of further that question of what is driving this. The next steps for us, continued monitoring. We've got 3 years on our initial permit to conduct this work and making sure that it feeds into bigger data sets to understand whether the changes we're seeing here mirror what's going on down the coast in Oregon and things like that. Also increases the chance of us seeing the same whales. You've already seen that with gull, that they'll shift between areas. Wendy mentioned the prey analysis, really big piece, that a lot of the prey work that was done here was done quite a long time ago. So updating that and trying to see if there are things that have shifted here. And like John was saying with the recruitment to the sounders, trying to understand if with these whales struggling to find food in the Arctic, are we going to see more and more new whales, if you like, joining our area or starting to become the locals here? And just to stress it, that you can't study these guys in a vacuum. It's going to require collaboration. It's going to require people working together. And the other big factor at the moment in both the States and in Canada is that funding's a massively limiting factor. Thank you, Caitlin.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you so much, Ashley. I know you both contributed to all this great work. We have a few more minutes in which we are going to be joined by Jackie Hildring to tell us a little bit about some actions we can take, and then we will get into questions and have our panel be able to answer those for you. So over to you, Jackie.
Okay, dear audience, currently there are 275 screens watching. There are 800 registrants who have signed on. This is a good sign. The last thing we want you to do, there's so much respect that you would want to know the depth, quite literally, of what is happening, what it means. And then the last thing we want, though, is that this is just adding to overwhelm and despair. It is called a wake-up call. You are part of that with us. And now what? So this is very much a call to action from the Marine Education and Research Society. It will be included, the details, in a sample letter in an email. And yes, there's a recording of all of this as well. So in that call to action, and it's reflected in some of the questions that have been in the Q&A as well, In Canada, currently, to reiterate what's already been shared, gray whales are protected as a species of special concern as one population. In 2017, the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada put forward that there be 3 populations recognized, not one, and that 2 of them get endangered protection. 9 years has passed. Since then, you very clearly have seen what has happened. So the call to action is that all gray whales on Canada's Pacific coast have to be recognized as endangered. And why is that so important? It's not just a word. It means a great deal under the Species at Risk Act. There's then legislated action if a species or a population is endangered. And that is everything from identifying critical habitat to the research dollars for the knowledge gaps to education. It's a bit tricky and messy, but there were 3 populations put forward for protection in 2017. And as Wendy has referenced, the one that was perceived not to be at risk is now half in its numbers. So that requires an emergency assessment. But the overarching call to action, one piece of it, all gray whales in British Columbian waters need to be recognized as endangered, so they get the urgency, the protection that the legislation under the Species at Risk Act offers. But also, 9 years is too damn long. Yeah, that as things change quickly due to climate change, the gray whales are teaching us a lot. They're indicators. It simply can't take that long for endangered populations and species to get the protection that they need, and certainly not when things are changing all the more rapidly. Please don't underestimate as well, also for our American neighbors, that really anything that we do to reduce climate change is better for all of us as well as for the whales. They are indicators. And it is not to be trivialized. And certainly, our dear American neighbors, as I blink my eyes, you may have noticed the power of voting and how that could have far-reaching consequences. We too are noticing that. Where do things come from? How much fossil fuels are being used in what we buy and what energy we choose for? Please follow us on social media. You'll see that in Canada as well, we are potentially getting the atrophying of the Species at Risk Act as well in order to push through energy projects. And then awareness. Thank you again for being on this call. Please share the messaging and the action, though, rather than again just adding to the pile of despair. So sharing the messaging about what is happening, what the solutions are, how urgent it is, making sure that your sightings count. There have been questions about that as well. But also for anybody, even if not a boater, do our whale-safe boating course. The number of the awareness again that is coming out of the likes of a gray whale being in Vancouver Harbor and then getting whacked by a jet ski, there has been this great awakening about how they feed as well and how close to shore they can be and how incredibly vulnerable, even if they still have enough blubber to be really buoyant. So the course has everything from how to reduce risk of collision, where to report if there are incidents of concern, and then also knowledge about whale behavior. So that's our call to action to you. There will be a follow-up email with resources. And now it's Q&A time. And now I just shift and look at the other side. Caitlin, I will proceed if that is okay. The top question asked by Zabe and Ben and Jen and Val and Barb and Gary and Jordan and Tegan and Bill is about the proportion of males to females that are in the known strandings. And I think clarification is needed too, that the strandings are dead animals. These are not animals that can be rescued. And John, please, could you address that?
Yes, absolutely. And I noticed that too. I was reviewing some of the questions. There also was one on age class that I thought I'd mention that the majority of our strandings have been of adult males. That bias, initially, we wondered if it was going to be related to how early in the season we were getting the strandings, but I tested our past stranding data to see if there tended to be a male bias early in the season that may be balanced out, because when you look at all of our stranding records for Washington State, and we're talking, I think it's like 350 or 400 strandings, there is a small male bias overall, but not a very big one. But I did not find a seasonal effect. So right now I'm going to put I'm going to explain the fact that they're mostly adults by the fact there have been very few calves born in recent years. So that age class isn't really well represented anymore, if you will, from the very low number of calves. And I'm going to say that the male part of that is a bit of a mystery. And I think it'll be interesting to see if it balances out at all through the year as we go further on, or if it stays male biased. I do know other areas to the north and south of us also have had a male bias. So that seems to be an effect, not just in our area. So I know that's not quite an answer, but a little bit about that and that puzzle. And it is a bit of a puzzle at this moment.
Thank you. And a related question, John, also for you from Ben. Could low calf counts be due to predation of calves before they reach wherever they are being counted?
Yes, and there is, there is something on the order of 20–30% of gray whales that you analyze their bodies, you find the signs of, orca whale attacks, and those are most common on the calves. And, obviously there's even consequences to some of the killer whales that specialize in feeding on gray whales with the low number of calves that are present. But we do know, even through this UME period, we have continued to see gray whale predation, on gray whales continuing, and it's been documented. So I think it's having an impact both on the gray whales and the reduced calves on killer whales. And it is obviously contributing further to the challenges gray whales face.
Thank you very much, John. I'm going to continue on here in the hopes of answering many of these questions. Wendy, part of this has been answered, but from Fran, is the Pacific Coast Feeding Group listed in the Pacific Northwest as endangered or threatened? And that part has been explained, typed out as an answer as well. But a subpart of that question was, if the macaw whaling is holding up the listing, so why it has taken 9 years to date in Canada for responding to the advices of COSEWIC.
Thank you for the question. I'm gonna have to think that one through a bit. The listing right now, the recommendation has been made to government. So I honestly don't know what the holdup is. I'm not privy to that. And I don't think the macaw wanting to continue their subsistence hunt affects that listing in Canada. That's my understanding.
Thank you, Wendy. There's another aggregation of questions that have to do with protections, and I'll address at least for the Canada side of things first. So are there rules for boats or water vessels, distance rules? So in Canada, what we can answer is that it is 100 meters for non-orca, except if they're resting or with a calf, then it's 200. But this is one of the ways that being recognized as an endangered species or population could make a difference, because that would be an impetus potentially for larger distances, like the southern resident killer whales have 1,000 meters. Maybe then, John, I think this is more on the other side of the border than the protections, but the questions include, is the area that the sounders use protected? Could it be closed down for the time that the sounders are there? And then a more overarching question about the pressure from vessels, including whale watch operators.
Yes, no, thanks. So those are great questions. And, on the U.S. federal government side, gray whales were removed from the endangered species list. At least the eastern North Pacific gray whale population was on the U.S. side as that population rebounded. And there is a petition to NOAA to reconsider that. because that was actually done in the late 1990s, preceding that 1999-2000 unusual mortality event. So some people have wondered, could we add protection by doing that? And certainly having gray whales listed in the US ESA does add levels of protection to them, though they are still protected under the Marine Mammal Protection Act in the US, so they do enjoy a certain amount of protection. I will point out that Washington State, for example, does its own designations of species that are in danger or at risk, and is in the process right now of evaluating. I've been in touch with the WDFW person that's doing that evaluation, and they're going to be making recommendations for state listing and considerations that'll involve both considerations of the sounders, the PCFG, and this new status of what's happening to the overall ENP population. So we have some, potential added protection there. A few years ago, we published a paper on biologically important areas. And we weren't sure how much significance that would have. We actually, NOAA got us to do it, and we did it for a number of species, including gray whales. And as a part of that, we designated the key sounder feeding areas and some of the important PCFG feeding areas in US waters as biologically important feeding areas for gray whales. And I've been surprised at the degree of, even though that had no legislative, or formal protection, it has resulted in more protection than I realized. Even things like some of the environmental groups suing the Navy over use of mid-frequency sonar, got agreements in their settlement, to not use sonar in areas that are biologically important areas for blue whales, using our designation for those areas. So sometimes even designating something, even without the weight of, law behind it, can end up having valuable, additions. The other protection that sort of, I don't know if anyone raised, but I'll just point out that, well, if the UME was declared over in 2023, should we declare a new UME, and would that provide added protection? And I just mostly point out the UME doesn't really provide protection. What it did was really cause NOAA to coordinate and scientists to coordinate and collaborate, much like Mark and Ashley were talking about being valuable. And the kind of cool thing is, even though the UME was declared over in 2023, the group of scientists reviewing the status of gray whales and even reviewing all the strandings on now a monthly basis on the West Coast continues to meet, even now for years past the UME. So I think some of the values of the UME declaration are still being enjoyed today, even though the UME was declared over in 23. So just some thoughts on all of that.
Thank you so much. And that does, Fran offered clarification that I got it wrong, that she was asking about the PCFGs in the US, which has been touched on. And Ashley also had a question about the protections in the US compared to Canada. A question for Caitlin.
Could I,
Oh, sorry.
Could I, Jackie, just, I did want to mention one thing that on the PCFG status, because I failed to do that. Canada and the IWC give more formal recognition to the PCFG as a separate unit than the US does. And I think that's been a little bit of an unfortunate byproduct of the fact that that designation and consideration of what represents a population is done by NOAA, and NOAA works in partnership with the Macaw tribe, on the whaling issue. And I think maybe politics entered into things a little bit on the US side, worrying that as they were evaluating the Macaw request to resume their traditional whaling, that would kind of, throw off this already protracted timing of their, approving the Macaw resuming their hunt. So, and there's some more complicated politics that relate to the IWC and that, but I think I'll stop there because I already interjected a little bit. But just to say, they don't enjoy quite the same level of protection in the US, and that would be nice to change maybe when the politics aren't as sensitive around the whaling issue.
Thank you so much, John, and apologies to Wendy, Ashley, and Paul. Not many questions for you. John's getting the load here, but to Caitlin then about sightings on both sides of the border.
Sure, and I maybe will call on our presenters to assist with this. So currently in Canada, we do not have a government-sponsored gray whale catalog at the moment. But indeed, there are folks like Wendy and Mark and Ashley who are contributing to a catalog of sightings off the West Coast. And so certainly I think that photographs of gray whales can be sent to them. And if you need our assistance in getting it to them, you certainly can. But the reason Jackie forwarded this to me is about sightings. And for many years, I looked after the Oceanwide Sightings Network, which is a long 2 decade plus collection of citizen science sightings. And so we do encourage you, if you do see gray whales, to please report them to the Whale Report app as a way of logging where those sightings are. Certainly, if you can, take identification photos and get them to Mark and Ashley at this point, and Wendy, then it can be added to the West Coast Gray Whale catalog. And then, John, maybe I'll pass it over to you if you want to add about where sightings and or identification photos from citizen scientists can be contributed in the United States.
No, thank you. And I'll keep that very brief just to mention, Cascadia does coordinate the collaborative PCFG catalog, and especially those identification photographs and sightings that are after 1 June are what we treat as part of the PCFG. And those are particularly valuable, especially areas outside some of the regular areas we survey. And those certainly can be, sent to us at Cascadia Research, and we would match them to our catalog to figure out if they are one of the known PCFG whales. I think there is a need for, and it was in that list of kind of research recommendations, to look at now taking advantage of the new automated algorithms that are available to more broadly expand a catalog of gray whales to the entire Eastern North Pacific population, something we were reluctant to do when we were hand matching because it would have bogged down our efforts to track the PCFG. But we have collected and compiled thousands of photographs, that could be a part of that, and others have collected them. And now that we can make use of automated matching tools, we can look to really use that as a way to come up with an alternate abundance estimate using photo ID and mark recapture. And that would be a direction that would then let us welcome photographs from any time of year and any location.
Fantastic. And we
Thank
will
you.
send out a summary of places to send sightings with the follow-up email and additional resources.
Okay, I can't let this one go. And please know, I don't know if you can see, there's more than 40 questions still. So forgive, we're trying to get themes more than anything. And the one that I can't let go, and I don't think Mark and Ashley will be either, are the humpbacks to blame? Yeah, not quite said that way, but there's 2 questions. Is there any understanding of whether the return of humpbacks has impacted the gray whale feeding areas? And then also, are we seeing any correlation between the gray whales and humpback whales doing poorly? So the number of humpback whales washed ashore. So humpbacks and grays are not directly feeding on the same thing. You have bottom feeders versus those feeding, depending on which humpbacks we're talking about, on the likes of krill and small schooling fish. So there is no correlation between the humpbacks having an impact on the grays directly. What is true, however, is that with warming water, and we were part of the research that was published, and so were Mark and Ashley, is that what was seen is that first up in Alaska, where they've had humpbacks coming back for a long time, very much have their finger on the pulse, that with the blob, the big heat wave from 2014 to 2016, they saw that whales that had been coming there, humpbacks, for years disappeared, never came back. Calving rates tanked. It went on for many years. And then through the whole North Pacific, then by looking at all the sightings that had come in, it was also seen that the number of humpbacks had been recovering from whaling and then tanked by 20%, also in association. So these species are all indicators of the marine environments. There's another one, unless Caitlin thinks otherwise, another theme we'd like to touch on is prey. Or sorry, Mark and Ashley, would you have anything else to add to that? Mark and Ashley also very much know humpbacks.
No, I meant to mention it. I guess the concern I have for the local whales, the PCFG, is that I'm going to try and join a few things together. What John was saying there about matching software, happy whale, due to happy whale with humpback whales, that was a big part of being able to look at that 20% decline in humpback populations. And I feel like that was drew people's attention that way, but there wasn't the same work being done looking at the impact of the blob on grey whales necessarily in the same way. And I think the dream scenario is going to be what John alluded to, that you use matching software, you have a different way to assess the population. And happy whale, for those interested, happy whale is live with grey whale ID work, and I know at the PCFG consortium meeting that they'd mentioned that was maybe a route to go. Just know it isn't always easy for local researchers to access the information that goes in there. So I would always say send it to two places, send it to Cascadia plus Happy Whale or something like that, so that it benefits both places. But I think the importance of particularly body condition work is going to be really important if we move into this El Nino system that's been predicted this summer. I think unfortunately that's where we'll see our local whales impacted worst.
Thank you. Question mark. John, on prey, there's multiple questions. Has the timing and location of the herring spot changed related to mortality events? There's concern about the herring fishery. Are there any data on trends and status of ghost shrimp prey availability for greys? And then also a question about, are some whales staying in the Baja lagoons to feed on red crabs?
I'll address one piece of that, but then I might kick it maybe to Wendy on the herring spawn part. And I'll maybe just address the sounder part. We have been concerned as the sounders have increased in numbers and increased in their duration, whether they are stressing the ghost shrimp abundance and what the limit of that might be. We don't have an exact answer, but it's part of what Hannah Clayton, who I mentioned, is studying. She's actually recalculating the biomass and exactly how much. We have a unique opportunity with sounders to actually measure exactly how much they eat, because from the tag data, we know how many feeding pits they create, and she's measuring exactly how much ghost shrimp and the caloric value of the ghost shrimp that's removed from each pit. So something that's not been possible with a large whale before, to completely measure the food intake and energy expenditure. So we're excited about that. And the burrowing ghost shrimp are longer lived than some of the benthic amphipods gray whales feed on in the Arctic, and they can live for many years. So we do worry about that having an impact. And there is a fishery, a commercial fishery, it's a very small one, for the ghost shrimp as well. So you have all of those factors we've been concerned about looking at the interplay of. And I think that could be a factor in that. But maybe I'll to get to the herring spawn part. I don't know, Wendy, or if somebody else, Mark or Ashley or Paul, want to jump in on the herring spawn part, but I'll punt to that since the best work on that's being done in British Columbia.
I can take a stab at that. The herring spawn, I think part of the question was, has it been, can you maybe repeat that, Jackie? Is it asking whether it's been larger or smaller, or
any correlation, I believe. So specifically has the timing or location of the herring spawn changed in the years where there have been unusual mortality events?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure if it has been quantified, looking at the years where there have been the unusual mortality events and actually looking at the herring spawn during those years. Yeah, I'm not really sure. I think generally from what I understand and the reports I get through DFO, the herring spawn, at least on the west side of Vancouver Island, where the gray whales are known to feed on the herring spawn, is still happening in typically the same areas with like Heshkuyat Peninsula area and Clayoquot and Barkley Sound being hotspots, and seeing gray whales feeding in those areas shortly after the herring spawn. So sorry, I can't quantify an answer to that. That's a good question.
Thank you. And I think I'm just looking at Caitlin, we might round off here, but a question that I feel hasn't been touched on, I think, is the whole issue of toxins and the losing of weight in the whales and what that means for their survival as well. And I'm wondering, is there somebody who wants to jump in with that? I don't know if there has been research looking at the buildup of fat-soluble toxins in gray whales.
I can comment a couple of things about that because we have studied that over the years, working in particular with Northwest Fisheries Science Center, and especially in the stranding starting in 1980, we were very concerned because gray whales that came into Puget Sound and were feeding on the bottom were being exposed to some of the toxins that concentrate in sediment, especially in the industrial areas. And even some of the whales that we examined, we had multiple whales and one whale dramatically with large amounts of human debris and garbage, sweatpants, plastic bottles, golf balls, towels in its stomach. And we thought that that was a physical or visible representation of the toxins that you don't see that also are on the bottom and demonstrating these whales are ingesting it. When you test the tissues of gray whales for contaminants, we actually found that on many types of contaminants, they were actually pretty low, reflecting likely that they feed low on the food chain. But we did find some things, surprisingly, levels of aluminum were very high, even at levels that might have been thought to be associated with toxic levels. But we think that actually might be normal for gray whales because aluminum is actually a very common element in sediment to begin with, not just from anthropogenic human sources. And they may have developed a way to deal with that. So I would say it is something we try to keep monitoring on, and we certainly don't think it's related to this recent mortality event. But I think it may be a factor affecting whales that feed in areas where there are contaminated sediments, a more localized issue. And we have that issue like there's an area, Willapa Bay, that a bunch of gray whales are feeding right now. And that's an area that in the past, they've used pesticides to control ghost shrimp because ghost shrimp interferes with the oyster aquaculture. So anyway, there are some localized issues, but not really a factor in the major mortality event.
And sorry, there is indeed one more question I feel hasn't fully been touched on, and that is that for animals already under stress, the proximity of vessels, disturbance, both physical and acoustic, with the knowledge that, of course, there's ecotourism in our waters all the way down to Mexico, where it is close proximity. But I don't know if there has been data that has actually looked at things like the stress hormones in feces in relation to proximity of vessels. I don't know if anybody can speak to that.
I could, but I know I've been talking a lot.
Sorry, you
for example,
know what I was doing there. I was pointing at you, not waving to answer that. Sorry,
okay.
John. Yeah.
Okay, I was just going to say yes. And in fact, even the Oregon State University group has done a study on stress hormones on PCFG whales and found a correlation with vessel traffic with it. So that, I was actually very surprised that they found that because I wouldn't have necessarily expected that for gray whales. They seem in a lot of ways relatively tolerant to boat approaches. In areas like the lagoons in Mexico, they're, some of the mothers with calves have developed this, even willingness to approach boats, and they don't use motorized boats in one of those lagoons, but it does seem like in some cases they're more tolerant and interact with humans in some settings. But I think it is a concern. And as these gray whales look for alternate areas to feed, part of the reason that you'd see on our table that a number of the whales that were emaciated also showed signs of blunt force trauma. That actually shows that by searching for these alternate areas to feed and maybe also their debilitated status, they actually become more vulnerable to vessel strikes and being injured that way, as well as entanglements like that. I will say, I think the Pacific Northwest whale watching industry, when we talk about whale watching, is one of the more responsible whale watching industries from what I've seen in other parts of the world. And I think that's a sensitivity that's come out of concern over protecting southern resident killer whales. But the protections of southern resident killer whales and restrictions around them have actually resulted in more whale watching activity, switching to humpback whales and gray whales. So you know, they're well behaved, but there's also been that switch for that reason. So I know that's kind of a mixed set of perspectives, but certainly something concerning that we have to keep an eye on.
I will
Thank
add,
you. Go ahead, Mark.
briefly, sorry. With the drone work, we did want that to have like a real-time impact, and being able to have a look at a whale that's malnourished or a whale that's not looking good. We were able, you know, in a local area, a small area, we're able to get word out that, hey, this whale in that place is not looking good. Can you give that whale a wider berth or avoid, choose a different whale? And there has been like immediate response to things like that. So I would say, you know, comes back to what I've heard Jackie say a million times, but whale watching is putting noise around whales and it's burning fossil fuels, neither of which are good. So the positives have to be that you're reporting your sightings, that you're sending those images to the right people, and that where you can, you just move away from whales that already are stressed enough.
Thank you guys so much. And I think that that's a great place for it to end up, with this idea of using precaution. Some whales may need more space, and we need to be monitoring in real time and nimble enough to react to these changes happening with the whales, not only among ourselves, but of course with our governments as well. Of course, cumulative impacts with climate change leading the way in the changes to prey, but other things potentially becoming more of an issue because of the stress of this climate change and diet. And that, of course, we need to be working together. And so I feel really grateful to Mark and Ashley and Wendy and John and Paul for being here tonight, in sharing their knowledge, in bringing this wake-up call to a further audience. And I hope it's something that we can continue to talk about, continue sharing information, and continue thinking about better ways that we can protect these populations that really seem to need extra protections and conservation right now. To all of you who are still listening to us, please watch for our follow-up email. We will be sending a recording of this webinar, as well as addressing resources for questions that potentially weren't answered. And we really want to thank you for all your excellent questions and for being here tonight. And I hope many of you feel the same as me, which is not only inspired and a new appreciation for gray whales, but that your concern and your worry has been heightened, and that creates motivation for us not only to do things in our everyday lives, but be pushing for change on a much larger systematic level as well. And I hope we also feel that there is hope. We see that this population has been resilient. We've heard some stories of resilience throughout tonight, and that hopefully collectively we can find some solutions and see this population rebound once again. So from all of us at the Marine Education and Research Society, and on behalf of all our presenters, thank you to everyone for being here tonight, and we hope to chat with you again soon. Thanks, everyone.